Morning, Glenn.
Good morning, David. How are you?
Good. This is working. That's great. We're talking on Skype. You're in. Where are you?
I'm in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil.
Wow.
And you are?
I'm in Washington D.C., which is nowhere near as glamorous.
The magic of the internet.
Well, I talked just the other day to Jonah Goldberg, who lives 4 blocks away, using the same magic. So it's quite a tool.
It is. You want to do introductions? I think that's
excellent. Let's begin. I was here just the other day, so I'm an old shoe. I'm David Frum. I blog at frumforum.com, and I'm talking for the first time to Glenn Greenwald, who is.
I am a contributing writer at salon.com, and I've done a few Blogging Heads sessions, but very long ago, so I guess there's all kinds of new platforms and features.
And you are the author of books, including?
Including How Would a Patriarch and A Tragic Legacy, among others.
Right, but your current top concern is the pending nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court.
That is one of my top concerns, that's true. And I guess there's a report today from CBS, or maybe from yesterday on Monday, indicating that there's at least some possibility that the president's going to be unveiling his selection as early as this week. It could actually be next week, and there's been reports that he's interviewed people who have been reputed to be among the top frontrunners, such as current Solicitor General Elena Kagan, Circuit Court Judge Merrick Garland, as well as a couple of others. So it seems like the initial indications of where this selection process would go is, in fact, by all appearances anyway, where it has gone. And my focus has been on concerns that I have, and I think that all progressives ought to have, about Elena Kagan, who has been reputed to be the frontrunner from the start.
Okay, why don't you like Elena Kagan?
Well, it's interesting. One of the reasons why I was glad to talk to you is because you played kind of a prominent role in the case against Harriet Miers, the conservative case against Harriet Miers. And I think a lot of the concerns, not all of them, certainly, but a lot of the concerns that drove the conservative backlash against Harriet Miers are at least as applicable to Elena Kagan, and in some cases more so. The primary concern of which is that she's really done an amazing job at making herself into a completely blank slate, so that anybody who says now, oh, if President Obama nominates Kagan, I'll be happy with that nomination, is doing so purely based on a complete leap of faith. I mean, there's virtually nothing that she's ever said or done or written that leads anyone to know what she thinks about almost anything. Not just legal issues and judicial issues and issues about how to approach the Constitution, but even more broadly, even political confrontations and political debates, and it's impossible to place her anywhere on the ideological spectrum. It's impossible to know how she thinks the Constitution ought to be interpreted. And the big concern is that, you know, it would be one thing if we were talking about replacing a conservative justice like Scalia, and it would almost certainly be the case that replacing him with someone like Elena Kagan would move the court to the left. Here, though, we're talking about replacing John Paul Stevens, who is the leader of the liberal wing of the court, to the extent that there is a liberal wing of the court. And so to pick somebody who's as much of a crapshoot, who's as much of an unknown as Elena Kagan, brings with it a very substantial possibility that President Obama could move this already conservative court even further to the right. And it just baffles me why any progressive would support a nominee about whom so little is known when there's so many outstanding, solid, progressive alternatives who we can know what their approach to the law is and what they think. And I don't know, that sounds a lot to me like the case against Harriet Miers.
Well, the case against Harriet Miers rested, I think, on 3 arguments. The first was, as you say, that she was a complete unknown. I worked with her, and I had a sense that one of the reasons I was so active in this argument was I had worked with her. I'd seen her in action. She's probably one of the people I saw in the White House most often. She was the staff secretary. She handled the flow of paperwork, and so everyone who generated paperwork dealt with her. So I was in that position of actually having some knowledge that most people did not have access to, and that's why I had to do what I did, which was kind of uncomfortable. So yes, she ideologically she was unknown. It was my strong suspicion that while she would vote in favor of executive power decisions, so long as then President Bush was in office, after that it was just a random walk. But there are 2 other elements, and I think they're different here. The second element was the case against Harriet Miers was not just an ideological case; it was also an intellectual case. Harriet Miers was not the A game of the conservative side of the legal world, and this was kind of offensive to a lot of people in the conservative legal world. We had spent. I was president of the Harvard chapter of the Federalist Society, the National Network of Conservative Lawyers, and we'd spent a quarter of a century developing a shortlist for future Republican presidents of able conservative jurists. You want a man, you want a woman, we got him. You want a northerner, want a southerner, got him. A lot of public sector experience, a lot of private sector experience, you got him. You want black, yellow, brown, purple, green, we got them. We've got everybody. You tell us what you want, and we've got somebody on the list for you. And this was defying that whole enormous intellectual project to pick somebody who actually was intellectually second rate, maybe not even that. And then last, and I think this, I don't know how you feel about this, there was a strong feeling that this was the president out on a personal diversion and frolic of his own. That is, that he was choosing Harriet as a way of rewarding a loyal staffer, not with sufficient awareness of the magnitude of the appointment.
Right. Well, I don't think the third factor is applicable here. I don't know how significant of a role that really played in the case against her. I mean, I read a lot of interviews and articles by you and a lot of other people in the last couple of weeks making the case against Harriet Miers, and that was certainly kind of a flavoring of it. But I think the case against Harriet Miers is really the first two factors that you identified, the first of which is clearly 100% applicable to Kagan. I mean, I challenge anybody to go and point to a single thing that she's ever done that gives any clue whatsoever into what her worldview is or what her approach to the Constitution and judging would be. But even, the second aspect of it, which is the intellectual suitability to the court, I mean, I certainly don't think that any of the things that were said about Harriet Miers' intellect or the fact that she's a second-rate intellect applies to Elena Kagan. I mean, by all accounts, she's extremely smart. So I don't think that's the issue. And when I first began writing skeptically about Kagan, I actually was willing to concede that part of the case against Harriet Miers was totally inapplicable to Kagan. That is, that there's no question about her qualifications or abilities. But I've actually reconsidered that because of what other people have said, including various law professors who have actually looked at what she's done as an academic and said that her written record of scholarship is unbelievably scant. I mean, it's actually hard to understand how she could have even gotten a tenured position on the Harvard Law School faculty, given how little she's actually written in the way of scholarship. And then even beyond that, it's pretty interesting that she was picked to be Obama's Solicitor General because the primary function of a Solicitor General was to be the president's litigator before the Supreme Court. I mean, you go to the Supreme Court, you advocate for the president's position, the administration's position. Usually, historically, there's been pure litigators, people who have been extremely successful and adept at, and successful at actually litigating. Before she was Solicitor General, she had never been before any court of any kind, never to make an argument, never to submit a brief, because she's been in academia and in government. She worked in the Clinton White House. And in the times when she's appeared before the Supreme Court, she's actually had a lot of difficulty because she's not really able to speak on the same level as the Supreme Court justices, just not because of intellect, she has that, but because of experience. She's just not well versed in how Supreme Court justices approach the law. And there was a story that she actually told recently. She was giving a speech at a dinner honoring Justice Kennedy. And she told this bizarre anecdote about how when she went before the Supreme Court to argue the Citizens United case, probably, the most consequential First Amendment case in the last couple of decades, certainly one of them, Justice Kennedy asked her about a line of cases that weren't mentioned in any of the briefs, but that every First Amendment litigator would know. Certainly the Solicitor General appearing before the Supreme Court ought to know. And she told this cute little anecdote about how she was completely mystified and panicked because she didn't know what he was asking, and to show what a gentleman he is and what a wonderful human being he is, he kind of intervened and saw that she was panic-stricken and told her what the cases were about and then asked her about them. And, that would be kind of a charming story if she were a first-year litigator. But for somebody who's the Solicitor General and is talked about to be the front-runner to replace Justice John Paul Stevens, to have that level of ignorance about such a major area of the law and an inability to converse with Justice Kennedy on something that was on his mind, I think does raise serious questions about her qualifications as well. So, I'm pretty flabbergasted that she's at the top of the list and that there seems to be such an acquiescence among progressives to that fact, given that she could have a very detrimental effect on the court from the progressive perspective.
Do progressives care about this point at all? This is something that concerns me, that I think about. One of the arguments that was made in favor of Harriet Miers was, well, she had been a corporate lawyer, and that kind of private sector experience was scarce on the Supreme Court. Now, in Harriet Miers' case, that argument pretty quickly collapsed because she had not been a corporate lawyer of great distinction. But it is true when you look at the current membership of the court. Stevens is the only person on that court with extensive experience counseling major private sector persons about their legal problems. I mean, John Roberts did private sector litigation, but he was an appellate litigator. And Sonia Sotomayor had a little bit of commercial experience, but at a pretty low level before she went into the district court. With Stevens, Stevens it was now 50, 60 years ago that he had that experience, but he was once a famous antitrust lawyer. And now there's nobody there who comes from any world other than the world of government and academia and high-level litigation where things are so abstract that you might as well be in government or academia.
Right. Although, of course, Kagan, doesn't have that experience either. And one of the interesting, she doesn't have much experience in anything that I can discern. Other than being dean of Harvard Law School, where she raised lots of money for the endowment, hired a bunch of conservative professors that endeared her to conservatives, which was a perfectly fine thing to do, and ideological diversity on the faculty is a good thing. Though it's hardly an indication that she'd be able to craft judicial opinions in a way that would attract conservative judges, the primary asset that's being touted. But there are actually alternatives who are being mentioned, such as Diane Wood, who, aside from having an extraordinarily impressive 15-year record as an appellate judge, where you can actually go read those decisions and know how she approaches the law and knows how she engages in the skill of judging, she's considered one of the foremost antitrust experts in the country. She prosecuted antitrust cases at the Clinton Justice Department in the 90s. That was her specialty, her expertise when she was on the faculty of the University of Chicago Law School.
Now, you see all these things as if they are features. Now, from the point of view of the Obama administration, I assume they're bugs.
Well, it's interesting because, and this to me is one of the principal selling points of Diane Wood, because as I'm writing anti-Elena Kagan pieces, I also spent a week looking at and talking to lots of people about Diane Wood and wrote a long piece, The Case for Diane Wood. One of the most, contested areas in politics that's likely to be before the court over the next decade, in the wake of the financial scandal and the economic collapse, is our laws relating to business and economics and things like, are banks too big to fail and what can legislation do in order to prevent that problem? And so I would think that progressives, including President Obama, who says that his main concern is having the court not invalidate his legislation, would want to have somebody on the court who is in the liberal wing of the court, the progressive wing of the court, who actually has credibility in those areas. And, judges listen to one another, and if you're a judge who doesn't know much about business or antitrust, you're going to be listening to your colleague who is sort of renowned in that area more than you will somebody who is completely learning on the job. And I think that's a huge selling point for Diane Wood and a major strike against Elena Kagan, which is that in all of these cases where Obama cares about most, his domestic legislation, she has serious expertise, and deservedly so, and is much more likely to be able to sway her conservative colleagues than Elena Kagan would. And, it's interesting because that's actually the primary factor that people are talking about in terms of replacing John Paul Stevens, because though he's talked about as the leader of the liberal wing, one of the things that he's been so skillful at is he has a great relationship with Justice Kennedy. He is respected even by the conservative judges on the court, at least the ones who are more open-minded. And so you want somebody on the court not just who is going to write good liberal opinions, but who has the skill to persuade conservative judges to join your opinion so that you're writing majorities and not dissents. And that's what Diane Wood, more than anybody else who's being considered, has done over the last 15 years on that very conservative Seventh Circuit court. She has a great relationship with Judges Posner and Easterbrook and other right-wing judges on the court. There's numerous instances where she swayed them to pro-plaintiff or progressive positions that they otherwise would not have been receptive to because they have so much respect for her abilities and specifically her ability to craft opinions that attract a consensus. So, it's not just that Kagan is such a bad choice, it's that there are so many good choices that if it is Kagan, I'll be amazed.
let me suggest a diversion. Let me depart here on a diversion and frolic of my own, which is an idea I've long had about how Roe v. Wade is good for conservatives and bad for liberals. And this is an example of it. I mean, the reason Diane Wood probably will not be the president's choice is that she has laid down abortion rulings that are going to excite a lot of opposition from not only Republicans but also pro-life Democrats who have just taken a nasty beating during the health care debate, and they'll be looking for something to prove their pro-life bona fides before the November elections. If there had never been a Roe versus Wade, if abortion were settled in state legislatures rather than at the court, wouldn't Diana Wood be in a much stronger position today?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Lots of people think that the Republican Party has thrived to the extent it has over the last 3 decades because of Roe versus Wade, that the kind of social conservatives who have provided the backbone of the party, who knock on the doors, who
let me reply.
Money,
Roe versus Wade helps to unify the Republicans because you can have because everyone can agree whether if you're a Republican, whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, you can agree that Roe versus Wade is a bad decision and should go. And so you have people like me who say, I think it should go, and then it should go into the state legislatures where I would vote for choice. Then other people would say, no, it should go to the state legislatures where we'll vote for life. But we can all agree on what we do next, which is how you hold together coalitions.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the Christian conservatives who have been very active in Republican politics over the last 2 decades, previously in the 70s, the 60s, used to kind of stay out of politics. That was sort of the secular realm. The more religious Americans often were times apolitical, and Roe versus Wade, so this theory goes, really injected them into the political process, which was a major boon for the Republican Party. But at the same time, just as much as anti-Roe versus Wade sentiments are kind of conventional orthodoxy among Republicans, believing in Roe versus Wade, at least in terms of believing that it's law, that it's not going anywhere, that it shouldn't go anywhere, even if it was initially a dubious decision, is very much conventional Democratic wisdom.
But isn't that Diana Wood's greatest vulnerability, right? Her abortion record.
I guess it depends on how much Obama is willing to go to the mat for Roe versus Wade and for abortion rights. I mean, the reality is her rulings. There was a partial birth abortion case that she had where she held the statute unconstitutional because it didn't provide an exception for rape and incest, a pretty mainstream position. She was joined in that by Judge Posner, one of the most right-wing judges in the country. There was another case. The other case that's mentioned is she ruled against abortion protesters outside of a clinic on RICO grounds, which is a very legalistic ruling about what extortion means and what it doesn't mean, and that was ultimately overturned. So it's not like she's some abortion fanatic. I mean, her views are very much in the mainstream of liberal jurists, but it just depends on how much Obama is willing to do that. I mean, anyone who he nominates is presumably going to be pro-choice, right? I mean, anyone.
Right. But if you're on the White House staff, the question is how much time do you want the hearings to spend on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, but I guess the alternative is that I think that Republicans, the strategy of Republicans over the last year that they've succeeded in kind of eroding Obama's popularity and approval ratings has been one to kind of avoid those culture war issues and focus on things like spending and national security. So I'm not sure that Republicans want a huge abortion war either in terms of a confirmation fight. I don't know. I think there remains to be seen.
That's probably right. The Democrats. All right. So you vote nay on Elena Kagan. You wanted to talk about some of the broader issues that you thought this indicated, like that you thought that Democrats and liberals were generally giving the president too easy a time.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about among Democrats, among progressives, lots of other people, about the closure, the epistemic closure on the right, a term that I've really come to hate, but that's the term that's in fashion over the last couple months, that there's this sort of orthodoxy and lockstep on the right, and that people such as yourself who are perceived to deviate from it are immediately declared blasphemous. And what's interesting to me is as I started to write against Elena Kagan and read about what was done in the case of to force President Bush to withdraw Harriet Miers, it became extremely difficult for me to envision a meaningful campaign on the part of progressives against any nominee that President Obama selects, even if he selects someone about whom they'll know nothing, such as Elena Kagan, in the way that conservatives demanded that President Bush withdraw Harriet Miers and replace her with Sam Alito. And I found an irony in that, which is that the left loves to mock the right for having this kind of authoritarian follower mentality where they embrace the party line and where no dissent is tolerated. And yet there was a case where conservatives imposed a huge, embarrassing defeat on President Bush, where they defied the White House's decision, where they demanded adherence to their principles, in a way that I have a very hard time envisioning progressives doing with regard to President Obama, not just in the case of the Supreme Court nominee, but in any instance. I mean, I don't see any of the, you look at what the right did with comprehensive immigration reform, whatever you think the merits of that are, they caused the White House a huge defeat by preventing that bill from passing. There were instances where the conservative movement went very virulently in opposition to positions of President Bush in a way that I don't see anything remotely like that happening in terms of the Democratic Party or progressives, which tend to be very, very supportive of anything that Obama does. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, having kind of experienced it firsthand, this whole epistemic closure cliche, what your views are in terms of how that works on the right versus the left.
Let's talk about Harriet Miers first on the broader point. Harriet Miers was done in the end by two things. The first was the interviews with the senators, where they ended up being
Republican senators, right?
Republican senators, especially John Kyle, who is a law professor and a very powerful intellect, and also a very staunch conservative. And the senators were disturbed and horrified by Harriet Miers' lack of knowledge. And so, by the way, was the White House counsel's operation. This is where it really was a diversion and frolic of the president. But the people who were in charge of preparing her to face the Judiciary Committee began to leak just how difficult a job that was. It was sort of Palin before Palin, that she didn't know anything. And they realized she was going to be sliced apart at the Judiciary Committee. That was then capped by the discovery of a speech Harriet Miers had given to some kind of Houston business group in the early 90s by Joe Becker of the Washington Post, which completely gave the lie to the administration's assurances that Harriet Miers was strongly pro-life. In fact, she gave a speech and made it clear that she was leaning in the pro-choice direction. Those two things led to a very abrupt collapse of a conservative world that until then had been following the president. Harriet Miers takes place in the fall of 2005 in October, and this is part of the decoupling of the conservative world from the president. After Katrina, Myers, and then immigration was the final part. So was the Dubai port deal, where, of course,
exactly.
The president happened to be in the right that time, but there was a loss of confidence. But on epistemic closure, I used to like the term until my logician friends explained to me it doesn't mean what everybody in the journalistic world thinks it means. And we sound like idiots to philosophers. So let me use it, though, just one last time at the risk of sounding like an idiot to a philosopher. It does not mean lockstep thinking. It does not mean conformity. It does not mean narrow-mindedness. Frankly, I don't think anybody can say right now that the problem with the American right is that it's insufficiently open to wacky ideas. The American right is all too open right now to wacky ideas. But epistemic closure, when Julian Sanchez introduced the term in a common speech, was taken to mean was a defiance of reality. That you created a closed knowledge system in which, for example, it was just everybody knew that when you cut tax rates, tax revenues went up. And it didn't matter what the table said. You just knew that as a fact. Another example, Marco Rubio's acclaimed speech at CPAC, which was an ode to the American achievement in upward mobility and the possibilities for somebody like him to start from nothing, or his family to start from nothing to rise, that you could write a whole speech by a possible future vice presidential candidate. It took no notice at all of the considerable research into upward mobility that finds the United States actually doesn't do a very good job of it compared to other countries, and especially European countries. That's what I think what Sanchez was getting at. That people knew what they knew from Fox News, and they didn't go look it up. For sure, there must be a lot of that on not so much the liberal side, but on the left. And I think we are seeing it now, for example, during the attempt to relaunch the immigration debate, there just seems to be no acknowledgement whatsoever of the real numbers on what immigration does and immigration means. I'm having to move my computer here so that somebody else can use the table. Longing has viewers for that. That was probably a rough cut. Just a word of explanation. There was a lot of gentle ribbing about the quality of the light in the last blogging enhance I did with Jonah Goldberg, and some people said my face looked like it was made of plastic. So I've gone to the room in the house with the best lighting, which is unfortunately my wife's office. So I had to she arrived home, I had to surrender her desk to her. So
Blogging Heads commenters are very gentle in their suggestions. I've noticed that too.
All right, so that we're talking about this conducting arguments without reference to the information. That's, I think, what is the phrase epistemic closure was supposed to get at. We see that, I think, a lot in the current round of immigration debate, where it's very hard for people on the liberal side to acknowledge some of the basic acknowledged facts about the way U.S. immigration policy has worked. Like, for example, that there's virtually zero net economic benefit to the United States from current immigration policy, which is a point attested both by the National Academy of Sciences when it studied the issue in the late 90s, and then again by the Office of Management and Budget when it looked very carefully at the numbers in the 2000s. The fact that we are not seeing a lot of upward mobility in the largest single group of immigrants to the United States, Mexican Americans, it's not happening. That the second and third, that each generation does better. Indeed, that the third generation seems to be doing no better, and maybe even a little worse than the second, and the fourth generation no better than the third. The Russell Sage Foundation did a big study of this question and said, well, if you look at immigrants with comparable educational and family backgrounds, they do as well as the native born, which is fine, except since the largest block of the people you're studying don't have comparable backgrounds, you have to exclude all the people you're concerned about from your study in order to get the result that immigration advocates want. That seems to me a case of left side epistemic closure. And I wonder if you have, but it doesn't, I don't think it means, because groupthink and conformity, those are universal human
rights. Right. Yeah, but I guess, this is the question I've been struggling with. I mean, this idea of epistemic closure, to me, right, it does not mean just simply that there's certain orthodoxies that you can't deviate from without being ejected from a group or having your credentials withdrawn in terms of membership in good standing, because that is universal. That's true. That's just tribalism. And I think, to me, what epistemic closure more means is this concept that, in essence, that there are a very finite group of sources who are deemed credible and worth listening to. And those sources are deemed credible and worth listening to, not based on whether or not they're actually credible and engaged in reasoned analysis, but whether or not they're embracing the orthodoxies that one wants to hear. And the way that this closed world is maintained is through simply discrediting any sources that question or challenge those orthodoxies. And so, for example, one of the things that always struck me as the most amazing disparity in how, for example, the right and the left see things is, it's been a staple of right-wing mythology for a couple of decades now that the quote-unquote mainstream media is the liberal media, that they're left-wing, that they spout liberal dogma, that they're hostile to conservatives. And at the same time, it has become increasingly an accepted premise of liberals. And certainly if you look at the liberal blogosphere, I think this was one of the two main motivations that led to the growth of the liberal blogosphere, which is a contempt for the mainstream media, and the view, at least in the last decade, that they were very sympathetic to Republican politicians, to conservative ideology, that especially during the Bush years they were incredibly deferential to the Bush White House, unquestioning, unchallenging so much of what took place. And so, I think that the reason why conservatives are able to maintain this idea that the media is a liberal media is because basically there are two different types of sources that you can look to for information. One are right-wing sources, like right-wing talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, Fox News. And then anybody who isn't Fox News or right-wing radio or Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity is by definition the liberal media that need not be listened to. And so the only information that you ever need to actually take into account or consider is information that comes from sources that aren't the liberal media, which by definition are sources that affirm and bolster right-wing orthodoxy. And so I think that's how epistemic closure works, is that you just pick and choose which sources you want to listen to that you think are credible, and anything that deviates from what you want to believe or that challenges what you want to believe, you just simply dismiss as lacking credibility and not needing to engage it or listen to it. And I just wonder, though, even in terms of the definition that I just described, the one that you just described, is this really new? Is this really different over the last few years as compared to what was taking place in the 1980s, the 1990s with the advent of Fox News? Why is this different now?
I think it is different, and here's why. I think that the main difference is the weakening of the traditional conventional media. And I don't think it's even right anymore to call them mainstream. But in 1985, I don't care how conservative you were, you couldn't ignore Time magazine. You couldn't ignore Newsweek. You couldn't ignore the New York Times. You couldn't ignore CBS. It just wasn't possible. They were so powerful, so present. And everybody whom you wanted to convince read them and watched them and was influenced by them. So they were huge facts in American culture. Well, that's just not true anymore. So it is possible to tailor your own reality in a way that, and to be an advocate and tailor your own reality that you couldn't be in 1985 because the audience you were speaking to could not tailor its own reality. Now they can.
I guess I question how much that really has changed. I mean, for a long time it was sort of this assumed platitude that things like the internet and the advent of cable news was going to, render us all kind of ghettoized in terms of the information to which we were exposed, that we would just be these, kind of stratified beings who only sought out information that bolstered our own conceptions and avoided things that challenged it. And there have actually been some recent studies, one of which was flagged recently by David Brooks in his New York Times column, that said, this is certainly my experience too, that the kind of technology that the internet is anyway, really almost fosters a greater degree of kind of cross-pollination of ideas. That, if you're on the internet, it's actually sort of hard to say stratified in your own realm, that inevitably you're going to encounter through links and through debates of the kind that we're having, and through arguments and the like, because it's always just a click away to be able to go from an extremely liberal website to an extremely conservative website. And I really question how much of that is really new now, and what the effect of the internet is on that. I mean, I can make arguments that it is easier to maintain this kind of closed system, but I think there's arguments to make too that it's actually harder, that you almost stumble into opposing ideas more easily, whether you want to or not, as a result of what the technology does.
Well, let me throw a hypothesis at you, and I don't have right now the numbers at my fingertips to prove that I'm right, and I may well be wrong about this, but let me try that. I think what we've moved into is an era of information oligarchy. That is, the best informed 5 million Americans are so much better informed than they ever have been before. And certainly, maybe the 1,000 best informed Americans aren't any better informed, but everybody who doesn't have access to this secret work of the government intelligence agencies down to number, American 1,001 to American number 5 million. Those people, thanks to the internet, thanks to cable, have access to information on a scale that was just once unimaginable. The next 295 million people, however, their parents and grandparents, they had to watch the news at 6:30, whether they liked it or not, unless they wanted to get out of the chair and actually physically turn the TV off. If they wanted to know what was new in cars, new in homes, they had to take the local paper, and that meant they got some not very good, not very maybe even fair, but some quantum of public affairs information. Time and Newsweek were in every doctor's office. Okay, those are the people who have been who are reducing their consumption of public affairs information. At least I'm going to hypothesize. So what is happening in the world of epistemic closure is the way that let's distinguish between the way those upper 5 million talk to themselves and the way then they talk to the other 295 million. And that it is possible for people that the next 295 million who have political or partisan leanings, they are the ones who really do get isolated. And then there's a feedback loop. I mean, one of the things that was really striking in this Blogging Heads I did with Jonah Goldberg the other day was when he was talking to me, Jonah was willing to concede that a lot of the things that are said on Vox and on talk radio aren't true and are harmful and destructive. And I think that's probably conscientious of where he is and where a lot of the people at National Review are. Then they turn around and they talk to the next 295 million, and you then are locked into a mindset in which the president is a Marxist, the president is a socialist, the president is trying to overthrow the constitutional order of the United States. And you have to reformulate your private thoughts in ways that don't jar those assumptions of your bigger and less well-informed audience in this age of information oligarchy.
with this claim that there's something new and recent to it is, aside from the fact that there's just an inherent bias to believe that whatever is in front of us is new and that things were better in this idealized past. I mean, that's just an inherent human bias to think that the problems that you're confronting are somehow new, and that things were once much better in this glorious age of, greater diversity and exchange of viewpoints and the like, is, to me, what it really seems like is just a kind of version of tribalism, that people like to cater their views and their beliefs to the things that promote their side and their agenda, and to reject and disbelieve the things that reflect poorly on the side that they've chosen. It kind of segues into the next topic that we wanted to discuss, which is the similarities between the terrorism policies of Obama and Bush. And I'll tell you why I think it relates to that. And that's something that you've written some about. I've obviously spent a great deal of time over the past 18 months writing about that as well. I remember very vividly when, in the last few years of the Bush administration, beginning in 2005, which is when I began writing about political issues, the kind of rhetoric that would issue whenever the subject was Bush's terrorism policies and civil liberties policies. Things like detaining people without charges, using war theories to claim that the entire world is a battlefield, that the president has war powers in the entire world whenever the word terrorism is uttered, the assertion of secrecy in order to prevent courts from adjudicating executive law breaking and the like. I recall the kinds of things that were said by progressives about those policies, that it wasn't just wrong and bad and misguided, but that they were grave threats to everything we know and hold dear, and that they were examples of shredding the Constitution and declaring war on the rule of law, and fundamentally and radically altering our political culture. Those are the things that I was saying, and I know that most progressives agreed with that and were saying the same things as well. And now you watch, not more than, a year later, when there's a Democratic administration in office, and you and I think both agree, based on what you've written, I think it's true, that the vast bulk of those policies that caused so much controversy among progressives over the last decade, with a few exceptions, mostly insignificant, a couple significant, but with a few exceptions, are ones that President Obama, that the Obama administration has adopted as well. Not just failed to abandon, but affirmatively embraced and adopted as their own. And
Eli Lake makes the important point. Eli Lake makes the important point in an article. I forget now where he wrote it.
In Reason.
Even where Obama changed the policy, he did not abandon his legal right to reimpose the policy in the future if it seemed good to him. But it's the legal arguments of the administration are the same, even when they adapt the policies.
Well, right, and even the changes have been largely symbolic. For example, one of the examples most prominently cited is the second-day executive order to ban techniques outside of the Army Field Manual for interrogations, and yet when he did that, the authorization to use those enhanced interrogation techniques, what most people, including myself, or a lot of people, including myself, call torture, had already been withdrawn. Or the order to cease using CIA secret prisons, the black sites, and at the time those were already empty. So not only has he reserved the right to reinstate them, but even at the time that he quote-unquote changed the policy, the change really was completely non-substantive, right?
All right, so we can talk about this let me just I know you want to talk about this from what it means from an information and media point of view. But let me just throw out a crazy hypothesis as to what it means in the real world. Maybe this doesn't mean that the president is weak-willed or insufficiently progressive. Maybe it just means that he's epistemically open. And when he confronted the paperwork, he thought, you know what? Bush, at least in the second term, basically had it right. Actually, I look at this and I think, Bush got a bum rap. And there's merit here. I've always had this vision of President Obama's, first security briefing, and the people from the CIA and the FBI come in and say, Mr. President, we'll tell you everything. Let us show you everything we know. And let us tell us everything we're doing. And if there's anything we're doing that you don't like, you tell us to stop it. And we will do it. And then the president has to ask that if I tell you to stop something and something bad happens, do you promise not to leak against me? Oh no, Mr. President. It's going to be your fault. You're going to own this. And he then decided, you know what, I'm going to continue with the Bush policy.
Right. I mean, look, it could be a lot of things, right? We can only speculate about what is in Obama's mind as to why he has decided to embrace the very policies that he spent the last 5 years vehemently condemning. It could be that he never actually was opposed to them and only said he did because he thought he had to say that to get the Democratic nomination. It could be that once in office he deprioritized those concerns because there's a political price to pay to changing Bush terrorism policies that he just isn't willing to pay. It could be that he gets scared by CIA and military briefers in terms of the things that he hears and doesn't want to risk it. It could be that he fears those communities and doesn't want to oppose. I mean, there's an infinite number of explanations.
All right, but let me give you one more, which is I think fair to him and then fair also to President Bush, which is after 9/11, the country's climbed a very steep information curve. That President Bush initiated a lot of policies in 2001 and 2002, some of which didn't work out that well, some of which proved unnecessary. By 2003, 2004, the country had sort of found its footing. And by 2005, we were doing more things right than wrong. And that by the time President Obama comes into office in 2009, we actually have a pretty good counterterrorism policy in place. That means that when some vicious psychopath tries to detonate a bomb in Times Square, that we actually have enough protections in place that it's very hard for him to do anything other than create a failed effort.
Right. I mean, I think that what stops most terrorism plots, including the one that we just saw stop in Times Square, is actually just traditional law enforcement policy that was in place well before 2001. I mean, basically it was surveillance videos and witnesses who noticed something strange about the car that caused the detection of that plot, and then we used our law enforcement resources to detect who the person was and to identify where they were and then to capture them. But put that aside for a minute. I think, look, I mean, if I were you and people like you, I would be saying exactly what you're saying, what you wrote, which is, look, progressives owe conservatives and President Bush and Vice President Cheney a huge apology because you spent 8 years screaming and yelling the most intense epithets and the most virulent accusations as a result of these terrorism policies that your president is now adopting and embracing and that you yourselves don't seem that concerned about. And so either you've changed your mind and realized that all those things that you were saying back then were actually wrong because these policies are good, as you just suggested, in which case you owe an apology, or you didn't really mean any of those things you were saying back then. You didn't really care. You didn't really think these things were shredding the Constitution and destroying democracy. You were just saying that for partisan gain, and now that there's a Democratic president in office doing those same policies and you don't care, it seems that your accusations are pretty insincere, in which case an apology is owed as well. So, the reason why I think it relates to epistemic closure is because even if you're right, and I think it's a huge speculative leap, but even if conceding that you're right, that the reason why Obama has decided to embrace these policies that he spent the last 5 years vehemently condemning is because he's open to secret information that he now in the Oval Office gets and has realized that he was wrong and Bush was right. It's not the case that the standard progressive, the standard Democrat, who spent the last 8 years screaming all kinds of epithets at Bush and Cheney over these policies, has had access to that secret information. As far as they know, everything is the same, and the fact that they are now so willing to stand by mostly meek and mute, while the president that they support embraces those same policies, to me is an expression of epistemic closure, because what it says is, we don't care what right and wrong are. We don't care what good and bad policies are. We don't care what the proper approach is. All we care about is that our side isn't criticized and that our side stays politically strong. I mean, isn't that exactly the kind of epistemic closure that is the right is being accused of by the left? In other words, that they don't want to hear facts that undermine their side's political strength or their worldview. They just want it bolstered.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's a lot here that is going on that is deference to established leadership, and maybe what happens is when you're in power, you defer to political leadership, and when you're out of power, you defer to media leadership. And right now, that if you and the people at MSNBC and Arianna Huffington and whoever else have sway or had sway in 2007 and 2008 were to speak up, people say, in the end, we defer to our political leaders. I mean, some deference to your political leadership is a good thing, right? Because they do presumably have information, not just fact information, but also information about the legislative process. That when Obama and the congressional Democrats say this is the best deal we can get through Congress, even if you're Jane Hampshire and you don't like it, you have to defer to us because this is the best deal we could get. And that's our information. It's not secret, but it's based on our experience of the actual preferences of the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I think your duty as a citizen, and the founders talked about this a lot, actually, is to avoid to the extent possible placing that kind of faith in the judgment of political leaders and instead to exercise your own independent judgment. So the idea that, well, there's some, and what's interesting is that rhetoric, well, there's this secret information that we have that you don't have, that if you knew, you would agree with us. That was actually that was the way that the Bush White House tried to sell Harriet Miers to conservatives, kind of trying to imply, well, we have these secret conversations with her, and wink, wink, she, told us she hates Roe versus Wade, and she's ready to overturn it, and she's going to be a good conservative on these issues that come before the court. She can't say that in public, but you should trust us that we have this information and that that's the case. And, of course, that was the Bush administration argument for the last 8 years, which is, look, if you knew what we knew and got all these scary briefings that we're getting, you would also be eavesdropping without warrants, no matter what the law says. And you would also be pouring water down detainees' noses and throats, regardless of whether it violates the Geneva Convention and domestic law, because the threat is so extreme, and we know this because we get our secret briefings, that these policies are necessary and justifiable. And I think, sure, there are instances where you have to accept that political leaders are going to know things that you don't know, but in terms of formulating your own judgment as a citizen, I think it's imperative that you demand to see the evidence that what you're being told is actually true before assuming or believing that it is.
Because there are all kinds of problems with it. I agree with you. I mean, in the case of Harriet Miers, they were just flat out lying. I mean, I spent probably more time talking to Harriet Miers than George Bush did. I mean, because I was just at a different pay grade. And, I could tell you I knew those things weren't true. And in the case, at other times, they're not lying. I mean, what happened, that is really the briefings that the president and the vice president got did contain all this scary information. It just happened not to be very valuable. And I think I look back on some of the Iraq War things and the WMD stuff. Remember that famous line of Susan Sontag's that if you want to know the Soviet Union and you followed all the best and most reputable sources, that you would have done worse than if you read, I was a matzo ball soup for the KGB type potboilers and the Reader's Digest. And that was a reproach to the left. It was also true that if you had listened to, all the fringe characters and crackpots on, and Scott Ritter and all the people who'd been discredited on Iraq WMD, you would do better than if you listened to all the most reputable sources and the CIA and British intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, the point. And, one of the things that I think is interesting is that that was the lesson of the Iraq War. At least it should have been one of the lessons, right? Which is that, even good liberals who were reading all their good authoritative sources, like the New York Times front page with Michael Gordon and Judy Miller and Tom Friedman, the, multiple Pulitzer Prize winning foreign policy expert, if you had been reading them, you would have been wildly misled. And were wildly misled about the state of the Iraqi threat. And yet if you were listening to the kinds of people who we were told were unserious and lacked credibility, you would have been informed, and you would think that something like that WMD debacle would have taught people. Just like, the fact that there were all kinds of people at Guantanamo who we were repeatedly told were the worst of the worst and were scary terrorists who ended up being completely innocent. You would think that these incidents would teach people not to have the kind of deference, even to their favorite political leaders, and their judgment, and would instead want to see the evidence. And I don't see much of that being true on either side of the political spectrum.
Yeah. Well, maybe we're getting to the end of our allotted time here. I mean, maybe some of this will show up. I mean, that this is still, for liberals, the first really good political moment since 1965.
Right.
So they're still enjoying the thrill. I wonder whether 18 months from now you won't say, well, everybody has arrived at a position where they're just as gloomy as me.
Right. I would also hope to know too that Republicans had a very good political moment in the early part of the decade and lending, sort of blind support to the party or to the leader, which, I think a lot of the country did, and certainly in the wake of 9/11, ends up being actually a really bad thing, that having internal debate and criticism and different factions fighting for different political objectives actually is what keeps a political movement vibrant and honest and healthy. So anyway, let's just quickly talk about the Times Square incident for a couple of minutes.
What do you have to say about it? I'm not sure I have much that's useful to say.
Yeah, well, here, let me ask you this question. We don't know very much. There was apparently a suspect who was detained off an airplane as he was heading to Dubai. He's a naturalized U.S. citizen originally from Pakistan. So we don't know anything about what his alleged role is, whether he had a role. He's just simply a suspect. But let's assume, just hypothetically, and again we don't know, let's assume hypothetically that he really is the person who had the primary responsibility for putting this car bomb in Times Square. He's a U.S. citizen. Do you think he is entitled to the same rights as all other U.S. citizens? Does he have the right to be Mirandized, not to be subject to enhanced interrogation techniques? Should he be shipped to Guantanamo? I mean, what do you think the government's obligations are when they detain a U.S. citizen in a terrorism case like this?
Yeah, I don't know how you avoid applying the full panoply of U.S. law in a case like this. I mean, this is, as you say, it's a U.S. citizen. Offense took place on U.S. soil, and it's a good chess move you've just made, because it can't be right that your legal rights vary according to the mental purposes of the act. I mean, if it turns out that this guy was attempting to detonate this thing because he was trying to impress an ex-girlfriend. A classic American crime, right? That's what turns out what the Washington Sniper was about. That's what John Hinckley was about. That he gets one set of rights. And if he was doing it on orders from or in communication with people abroad, he gets a different set of rights. That can't be right. So the boundary between the people who are detained in Afghanistan has to be one of, are they U.S. citizens, not what was the purpose and intent behind their action.
So, for example, like the Jose Padilla case, who was an American citizen detained on U.S. soil, and yet denied for years the right to be charged with a crime or have access to a lawyer. You're against that? You think that went too far?
Well, I certainly didn't at the time, but when that's what follows. That's why I said it's a good chess move, because then you think, well, then in that case, all of those things would apply to this man in Times Square, and that strikes me as, I think it would strike most people, is that can't be right. That this I mean, even on the worst possible construction of who he was, and that he was of sound mental state, and that he was deliberately trying to kill millions of people, or thousands of people, in order to serve the ends of a foreign enemy. It can't be right. And so that makes you wonder, that makes you think, well, then the Padilla case can't be right either.
Well, just to try and to extend your chess metaphor, to try and turn my pawn into a queen, let me just ask you this last question then. The Supreme Court has said forever that anyone who's in the United States legally, whether a U.S. citizen, a foreign national, somebody with a green card, has exactly the same constitutional rights, because the Constitution actually limits what the government can do to people inside the United States. It doesn't vest specific people with specific rights. So assuming that that's true, and it's 100-year-old Supreme Court case law that's been applied over and over, that you don't have to be a citizen to invoke constitutional rights, that as long as you're here legally, shouldn't that same thing be said if he were a Pakistani national?
Then you bump into the ex-party queering.
Right.
That people have waded ashore from the enemy submarine in order to do harm to the United States.
Someone who actually enters the United States with the specific purpose of committing an act of war.
Right. Those people, I have to say, I have a hard time saying that the court was wrong about the queering defendants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I guess the question is, somebody who's living here for a long time with their family, has an ordinary life for many years, and then suddenly engages in an act like this, and then I guess you get into those questions. Last question about that, and then I think we're done, which is, when I look at these cases like the Times Square failed attempted bombing that was incredibly crude and amateurish, even if it had worked, what it says to me is that people who talk about the threat of terrorism as though it's an existential threat and compare it to things like the Civil War, where 50,000 Americans were being killed every weekend, or on many weekends, are so overblown, because in reality, the kind of threat that terrorism poses, when you look at things like this, shows how foolish it is that we would start changing the kind of government we have, our system of political protections and the like, in order to protect against it. Of course, other people use it to say a car in Times Square was about to explode. Do you see we were right all along? This is an existential threat. How do you see it? Do you see it confirming the kind of hyped up claims about terrorism, or do you see it as subverting and undermining it?
Neither. Let me give you a third option. I think if you tell the story of terrorism against the United States, what I see is a narrative where from 1990, really from 1982 to 2001. You see plots that get ever more sophisticated, ever more elaborate, ever more deadly, that reach closer and closer into American soil from Beirut to East Africa, and then finally arriving inside the United States. What I see after 2001 is a steady deterioration of the sophistication of these plots. The plots become more incompetent, more amateurish. The terrorists have a harder time communicating with each other. So what I see is a very successful counterterrorism effort that begins after 9/11, gets off to a rocky start, but that actually is now delivering some real security to people. And I think we are safer and better off than we were.
Let me just ask about that, because it's interesting. In the very beginning of the Clinton administration, that was when there was the first World Trade Center attack. And essentially for the next 8 years, and the claim is that the Clinton administration used a law enforcement approach, and there was the wall between the intelligence and law enforcement community. For the next 8 years, there were no terrorist attacks from Islamic radicals on U.S. soil. There was Timothy McVeigh, but there were none on U.S. soil. So wouldn't that say actually that approach worked?
No, because what you see is a rising trend of warnings. You see the plan to blow up airliners over the Pacific. You see the attacks on the embassies in East Africa. You see the attack on the coal, U.S. warship. They're getting better. They are not yet. They haven't yet had their big success. But each major plot, is an improvement over the last. They're foiled one after another by good luck or good police work. But as watching these things, you say these guys are getting smarter. They're getting better. They're getting more ambitious. They're getting more sophisticated. And then you look back on the trend line since 9/11, and at each one you say they're getting dumber, they're getting worse, they're having a harder time communicating with each other. That's what I mean by a trend up and now a trend happily down.
Right. I guess the question is, we poured huge amounts of resources into law enforcement efforts, into greater cooperation with other countries. We also did the kind of things that made the Bush administration controversial, and the question is, what was effective? Was it the better law enforcement approach that disrupted these plots? Was it those controversial programs? And I guess that's an ongoing debate.
I can't answer that. I can't answer that question. And in many ways, I think you look back on the way authorities deal with any kind of crisis. And, when we look back on the financial crisis and we didn't plunge into a Great Depression, which particular things was it that saved us? And then do you say, do you draw the conclusion, well, gee, they should, we sure are a lot smarter than those people who were reacting at the time, and we have a right to be really critical of them. Or do you say, when you're in a crisis, you don't know what's going to work. So you try 8 different things, including some things that you never thought you would do, some things that are maybe hidden in the back of the policy tool closet. And then afterwards, we can do an after-action report and say what worked and what didn't, and it will never be clear. We'll have to debate it. And we'll probably never arrive at a certain answer. But you can say, at least it's better. At least, we've never had another 9/11. Look at this thing and compare it to the sophistication of 9/11. Something went right. Just as when you compare what happened in 2009 to what happened in 1931, you say something went right.
Right. I would hope you would say we should try lots of tools in our toolbox, assuming the tools are not illegal, not immoral, and not counterproductive. And then I think that debate does matter. Just the mere fact that something was tried and things got better doesn't mean that those specific things that were tried were responsible for the better results. And I think figuring out what worked and what didn't actually is important, right, to know what you're going to do in the future.
Well, obviously, I don't want to do counterproductive things, but I am a big...
Or illegal things, right?
I'm a big believer in the public safety as the supreme law, and I think that in times of crisis, I'm a person, I recommend to people they read the volumes of Max Hastings on the history of World War II, that sometimes to save a society, leaders do some things that don't look very good in the light of history, that they break the law. They do things that are immoral.
So you think presidents have the power to break the law if there's good results to be achieved?
I think it's like the story in Herodotus of the people who propose things with ropes around their neck, that I don't think they have the power to do it. I don't think they have the right to do it. But I think sometimes they do it. And then afterwards, they are judged. And I think the constitutional order is pretty robust, and it will survive these. So President Bush may have done some things that were everybody would have thought before were illegal. He did some things that a lot of people think were immoral. And we don't do them anymore. The crisis has passed. The country's found a new footing. But
so when ordinary citizens break the law, the things that even if there's good reasons to, what happens process, they get charged, there are consequences. Do you think presidents should be treated differently than ordinary citizens when presidents break the law?
There's a line of, again, to quote, Cavour, the great Italian statesman, once said to one of his colleagues, "Gentlemen, if we did for ourselves what we have done for Italy, what great scoundrels we would be."
All right, well, let's leave it at that. It's an interesting
Great. And there we hit the fundamental epistemic divide, I think.
That's a whole new blogging head session at least.
Bye-bye.
Bye, David.